Good afternoon and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Director of Communications at PFLAG National. Great to have everybody here today. As always, I'm going to bring in my friend and colleague, Jean Marie Navetta.
Hello, Liz Owen. How are you doing?
I'm good, my friend. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. I just realized I have not prepared my mask for today's meeting, for today's show, so I'm already kind of in a bad place, but we're going to have a really good guest to make up for my incompetence.
Excellent. Well, don't leave your house without the mask, and I'll leave you to it.
Thanks, Liz. Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Navetta. My pronouns are she and her, or if you speak Spanish, ella. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. And every single Thursday at this time, we get together to talk about something. And what we are talking about is an article that was interesting to us. What we do is create an article. We find the article, we create some questions to start the discussion, and we invite a friend or two to have a conversation. And this week, we're actually talking about a new report that came out about youth who are atheists, and it's significant data about these youth who are LGBTQ identified too, and the experiences that they are having. And to do this conversation, we're actually going to talk to one of the very smartest people that I know in DC, Allison Gill, who is the Vice President for Legal and Policy at American Atheists. And I'd like to welcome Allison in now. Hey, Allison.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. It's always really exciting when you read an article and you see the name of somebody who you know in it and you think, I can call her. So thank you for doing this. It's so exciting. So I actually want to start with something that I don't typically ask people to do, but I think that in this case, it's really important. First, can you tell us a little bit about American Atheists and what American Atheists do? And then I'd also like you to talk, if you would, just to frame this, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. When we're talking about atheism, what are we talking about?
Sure. So American Atheists, we're a national nonprofit. We were actually founded in the 60s by Madalyn Murray O'Hair after she won her case at the Supreme Court involving school prayer. And we've been around since then. We advocate for the civil rights of atheists and non-religious people and fight for the separation of religion and government. And so, atheism is simply the lack of belief in gods. That's really all it is. It does not have any specific religious trappings associated with it. It's not itself a religion. It's simply the lack of belief in any deities. But despite that simplicity, there's a lot of stereotypes about atheists and stigmatization of atheists and non-religious people, which is why we felt like we had to do this survey and why we're speaking about it everywhere we can.
Well, the survey is impressive. So you talked to over 34,000 people for the survey itself, and about 10% of those fell into that 18 to 34 age group. And one of the really interesting things that I found that was right sort of at the beginning of the article that we're talking about this week was that it was the executive director of the Secular Student Alliance said that he regularly hears students say it was harder to come out as an atheist than to come out as LGBTQ. Could you talk a little bit about what you learned from that and any sort of personal element to this that you have learned along the way? Because I don't think that a lot of people would necessarily go to that conclusion.
Sure. And I have to say, I think that is different for everybody, right? I think people have very different family circumstances and communities and religious communities. And as I'll talk about in a bit, but different areas of the country are very different when it comes to religious belief and how people are treated and how non-religious people are treated. But it's interesting, both American Atheists and also Secular Student Alliance, I think we're kind of unique in organizations that all of our leadership of both organizations are all LGBTQ. So we actually have that experience of being both, non-religious and for example, I'm trans. So, coming from that perspective, I do hear this a lot, and it's, like I said, it's different for everybody, but often people have more trouble being open about their beliefs and are facing stigmatization because of their beliefs than about their, sexual orientation or gender identity. And I'll tell you, it actually was true somewhat for me as well. I, came out as trans without much problem. It was very well received in my family, no real issues. But for years afterwards, my mother, if I was going to talk about my beliefs, would be, say stuff like, "Don't talk about that," or don't say you're an atheist," or "Don't say that." She much more so had a problem with that, and I don't think she was thrilled when I left LGBTQ orgs to go work for American Atheists. But we don't actually talk about that much. But it is interesting. It carries a different type of stigma, and it's taken different ways by different people.
I have a question that we sort of did list in the discussion questions, but because we're in this space, I'm sort of interested to know your opinion. Do you feel that it's that a lot of people associate queerness with the idea of being godless in some way, that that there might be some sort of causality? So a young person coming out as queer, their parents or family may be assuming that that has made them godless or belief free. Is that, or am I drawing some weird conclusion from the data?
I think you might be right. I think people have this stereotype of non-religious people thinking that they are non-religious because they've suffered some trauma or because they want to do things that religion disapproves of, or like being gay. It's a strange sort of, I don't know, transference of identity. But yeah, I think that there is some of that. And I'll also say that a lot of times in LGBTQ communities, there's a lot of emphasis on accepting religions, and, for example, showing that religion can be accepting. And so sometimes they can be not the most welcoming places for non-religious LGBTQ people, which is kind of strange if you consider such a large percentage of the LGBTQ population is non-religious. It's, some would think it's around 40%. So it's very large, but still there can be some ostracization or just, I guess, unwelcomeness.
It's really interesting as you said that. I was thinking about the fact that when I think about the resources we create, so many of them are for people of faith. Yeah. And it's not talking about the absence thereof. I think there's sort of an assumption that that's not even a conversation that needs to happen, but this clearly proves that we do need to have one, and we need to deal with our own baggage around it, even in our own community.
Yeah, I think that non-religious people, like LGBTQ people, actually, they sometimes have a lot of religious trauma, right? And sometimes they need a place to work that out. And bringing religion into every aspect of lives and activism and gatherings is actually exclusionary in some ways. Like, I'll give you an example. Every year there's a Trans Day of Remembrance where people go and they talk about people that have died and the incident, the epidemic of violence against transgender women, especially transgender women of color. And most of them I've ever been to have been in churches, and that's fine. But it's also kind of exclusionary sometimes. Like, it's good to sometimes have gatherings that are not in churches.
That's a really good point. It's actually something we talk about at PFLAG. We say if you're meeting in a religious building, that could be a challenge for some people. And so we try to raise awareness. But I think you're right. It's a more difficult conversation, and it's one we're less used to. So I want to talk about the data because I love numbers.
Me too.
I can't help it. It's just like a nerd thing. I can't seem to get past it. I want to know about the data on non-religious youth in the U.S., specifically the non-religious LGBTQ youth. So what in there was interesting to you? Was there anything that surprised you about what you found? And were there any trends? So I know that's 3 different questions, but I just sort of want to jump into a conversation about that.
Sure. So we found that about 45% of the samples, of the 10% of young people, which is ages 18 to 24, who participated in the survey, we found about 45% were LGBTQ, which is higher than the rest of the older participants. So it's a very high number, and it's sort of what we expected, because I said before, 40% of LGBTQ people are non-religious, so perhaps not surprising. Those young people we found were more likely to have families that were somewhat or very unsupportive of their non-religious identity. So we know that LGBTQ people face family rejection, and also non-religious people face family rejection. It's probably not surprising that non-religious LGBTQ young people face more family rejection at a rate of about 40% of people who said their families were aware of their identities. We also found a higher level of stigmatization, about 10% more stigma, and also they were 10% loneliness. And we had scales measuring level of stigmatization and loneliness to sort of be able to assess these types of things. So those are some of the differences. I think the most shocking differences I saw were the incredible level of difference between people who live in very religious areas versus people who live in not very religious areas.
Tell us a little bit about that. I'm interested.
Yeah, so I grew up in New Jersey and I lived in DC. So those are the 2 places I lived in my life. So
Jersey's the best state. We all know this. It's just a given, obviously.
It's very religiously tolerant, not a big deal to be non-religious. However, we hear every day from people that live in Mississippi, Utah, places in the country that are very, very religious, and they have a very different experience of what it's like to be a non-religious person in America. Our statistics show just a marked increase in discrimination, especially in places like education, in the workplace, in healthcare. There's all these, we receive stories from over 10,000 people while participating in this survey. And, people saying, getting mental health care, well, the reason that you are having these issues is because you left church, you need to go back to church, like just trying to access for dealing with like healthcare issues. That's just one example, but people being afraid to come out about their beliefs because their students, their children would face ostracization in schools. So that there's all sorts of, especially in small communities, there's places where the heart of the community is the church in many places in this country. And so if you are non-religious, you are just socially isolated in a way that's not present in other places. So I think that's what it shows us, those of us who live in places that are very tolerant, that, although this country is becoming less religious, it's not happening uniformly, and it has an impact, especially on those non-religious people that live in very religious communities.
Thank you. One of the things I found interesting was, and I wrote my notes here, 36.3% of people, youth who said that they'd experienced rejection came from what they said was a relatively relaxed religious environment. So it didn't even seem like you had to have a super strict religious upbringing to trigger a negative experience, that it seems like just hearing the word atheist seems to set some people off. Is that true? I mean, because it seems like, obviously the people coming from the most religious environments saw the biggest level of discrimination, but it seems like no matter what was there, it still led to some discrimination. Am I reading that right?
There was some level, I'm not exactly sure which that you're referring to, but it was significantly less in less religious areas. So it was, on the report, if you take a look at it, I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. So I think you're talking about social media.
Yes.
Okay. Well, social media is everywhere at once. So it's hard to say, that where a person lives is going to make that much of a difference, right? So that might be an area where there's less, differentiation based on where they live. But if you look at places like education, it's about 21% said in less religious areas that they face some sort of discrimination because of their beliefs. And it was nearly 50% in very religious areas. So 1 in 2.
Wow.
And so what those incidents are, what that means, it's hard to say. I mean, this is a survey of thousands of people, but it is really, really high and something that needs to be addressed.
One of the things that I thought was very interesting were the questions about what non-religiously affiliated individuals saw as their priorities. And very selfishly, my eyes went right to LGBTQ, which was 81.7% of youth said that was a priority for them. One of the other places where it showed up, and I found this fascinating, was 85.2% of youth responding said that one of their biggest priorities was ensuring that sex ed is accurate and comprehensive. So it seems like with some of this, with an identity as an atheist, it seems like people were very focused on on addressing specific places where these kinds of discrimination show up. And I don't think everybody would necessarily expect it to show up in things like sex ed classes. Could you talk about what that might look like for youth?
Sure. So I think non-religious communities and our population, our constituents, have always been very interested in things like sex education because, they support pursuing things that make sense from a scientific point of view. And, there's been so much research showing how important sex education is. It's just beneficial. It helps young people grow and thrive and become, thriving adults. It's really, really essential. And it has just all sorts of positive repercussions when you have good sex education throughout a person's life and throughout our society. And the only reason we don't have better sex education is because of people's religious beliefs. And so I think that's why our, non-religious people are concerned about it, because it's having such a dramatic negative impact on our society. Like if you go to Europe, they have much more well-developed sex education programs throughout, and there's a lot of benefits of that. So I think that's why we're seeing such a reaction here. And young people, they recognize the need for this, and they're not getting what they need because of other people's, hang-ups.
And I really loved those priority issues. I thought somebody who doesn't know about this that much could look at this and think, how does that relate to this? And how does that relate here? And I didn't realize it related there. So I found this report so fascinating because it made me think more comprehensively about all the places that this discrimination shows up, that I will say, as a person of faith, I'm not even seeing some of it because it is so outside of my experience. Although as a queer person, I probably should be sharper to paying attention. So I want to talk about what we do, because as you know, PFLAGers really love doing stuff. That's what we do. We get out there and do stuff. So with this information, what can people do? So like, what can the everyday person do? Because one of my other questions was, where does this show up in people's everyday stuff? I noticed that social media was a big place where discrimination against non-religious people really shows up. But how should people be using this research? What kind of conversations should we be having? And what behavioral changes can we make? Also, can you solve world hunger and world peace while we're here too?
Oh, I mean, I have a few minutes left, so I think I can fit all that in. Those are great questions. And I feel like helping to raise awareness is really helpful. Like having conversations, because I guess I mentioned before, in areas like New Jersey and Washington, D.C. that are religiously tolerant, I don't think that people think that religious oppression is no longer a thing. Or if it is a thing, it only applies to groups like Muslims who absolutely face religious oppression. But it's not true. It applies to every religious minority, and it also applies to non-religious people, especially in particular areas of the country. So helping to elevate that, I think, is beneficial. And because you are all involved with PFLAG, especially when you have gatherings, keep in mind non-religious people and how they might react to what's happening and what you're thinking about. Like if there's there's not obviously nothing wrong in recognizing people's faith and celebrating that. At the same time, if that's encouraged and everyone's encouraged to go to church and it's taken it for granted, and there's no space left for other types of viewpoints, then that can be really off-putting and encourage people not to participate. And I think the Trans Day of Remembrance example I gave is a good one. I would also say that online gathering, I think, is really important. Just like LGBTQ people, young people, non-religious people are all over the country, and they're often in places where they don't have community. And so I think that there might be really good opportunity. I mean, there are really good spaces online for people to gather. And I think that is something that's also more needed. So helping to create those spaces as well, so that people don't feel so alone and are able to connect with people with similar viewpoints and lives would be beneficial. So there's just a few. But there's also, I should mention, in the report, a list of recommendations in terms of policy and various other issues. So we tried to give some guidance there.
I'm going to go ahead and just take the lid off of the jar and say, charter schools, can you talk a little bit about vouchers and how this relates to that conversation?
Sure. So one thing we're encouraging as a policy change is to, not have voucher programs, basically, or to discourage voucher programs. And this has an impact both on LGBTQ youth and also non-religious youth, and also LGBTQ non-religious youth, because what voucher programs do is they divert money away from public schools and they send the money to private schools. And the vast majority of private schools are religious. And I think sometimes people don't recognize that these schools have very few restrictions on them. They are allowed to discriminate. So even if your state has great non-discrimination laws, if the program takes the money away from public schools and gives them to private schools, those schools can then pick and choose who they bring in, and they can exclude people based on their beliefs. And they have almost complete ability, for example, to fire teachers for being LGBTQ or non-religious or really anything else. They have, they can teach all sorts of negative things. Like there's no real restrictions, especially on the religious schools. Like if there's been analyses of what they've sort of taught that have just been completely off the wall in many cases. So I think it's important to know that.
I'll just say there's some interesting curriculum out there. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah, interesting is a good word. It's remarkable what some schools, quote unquote, schools teach, and they're getting money from the state to do this, and also getting money from the state to allow discrimination. So we're basically making the schools that serve everyone worse in order to give a small amount of money usually, which usually doesn't make a difference for most people, to go to a school which is allowed to discriminate. So that's why we are urging people to sort of not have these.
I think it's an interesting connection, which a lot of people miss. And I think specifically in the queer space, that's really, really important. I have noticed the side conversation that's going on, and I have to tell you, people are commenting and talking all over the place. So I'm going to ask Liz if she will pop back in and share some of that with us. Because most before my mommy is out there, and she actually asked a question. Lord help us all.
Your mommy is out there. I'm going to bring in a couple of other. First of all, there were some good comments when we were talking about things that can be done. You know, in terms of where PFLAGers hold meetings and where people can meet, places like coffee shops and libraries, as opposed to churches, which can feel really uncomfortable. And then also, as when you were talking about the school conversation from PFLAG Boulder County, talking about how they can also make their own sex ed curriculums, and what those look like, not just not inclusive, but
many are very exclusionary or just pure hateful for LGBTQ youth, frankly. Yeah, so it's something to keep in mind.
Then we had two stories up. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling, of Jamie Henkel, who was outed by her sister as a nun, meaning no religion, to their mother while they were at St. Paul's Cathedral, and that was quite an experience, I would have to imagine. But this one I thought was really interesting. Had an experience with a trainer, I'm guessing based on, I know Jamie, you know, a classroom trainer during a learning session, who spent time trying to convince Jamie that she wasn't allowed to identify as nun, that he seemed to need an identification beyond nun. I mean, is that something? That was a new one to me, and it sounds so incredibly personal and uncomfortable.
I don't think I would ever try to tell someone what their beliefs are in that way, like what the label should be for their beliefs. I will say, though, that nun is a very, very broad category that was developed sort of by the research groups like Pew Research Center. And it encompasses not just non-religious people, but like a whole bunch of people that just aren't affiliated with any specific church or beliefs. So that includes a lot of people that are religious or that believe in some sort of deity, as well as atheists and agnostics. So it's kind of like a mixed bag a little bit. So when you say nun, it kind of is a little bit unclear, but if that's how a person identifies, that's how they identify, right?
Right. It is really personal. So Jean Marie, I am going to bring your mom's question here. And it's an
interesting one, and it actually gets to what Allison was just talking about.
Yep. About whether many LGBTQ plus folks, while not religious or spiritual, having been or feeling disenfranchised from organized religion, even if they might still feel some kind of spiritual connection of some kind.
Sure. I mean, I think we hear a lot of that from LGBT people. It's hard to sort of make a broad assessment because I don't know. It's hard to say, like, in a question, like, are you spiritual? Like, what is spiritual can mean a lot of things. Yeah. I'm not exactly sure what someone means when they say spiritual most of the time, quite honestly. So I can just tell you that a lot of the surveys show that, you know, LGBTQ people often pick the nun category, which, like I said, is a very mixed bag. It can mean non-religious. It can mean spiritual. So I think that's a little bit confusing in some ways. It's hard to sort of pin down exactly. But for our research in this report, we did not use the nun sort of framing. We asked people who actively identify with one or more non-religious labels, like atheist, humanist, freethinker, skeptic, agnostic, those sorts of things. So this report is more so about people that are non-religious than the nuns, if that makes sense.
And it makes sense. And I actually think what you're raising is a really interesting challenge, because I use a lot of that Pew research, and we look at that research a lot. And there is a lot of ambiguity in how these definitions have. So, I mean, the term spiritual, the term agnostic, that nun term, I think it makes this conversation so muddy sometimes. Even and I have some experience in this, feel like I consistently get lost. And I wonder if part of that is because people are just uncomfortable talking about this sometimes.
I think so. I think, yeah, there's a lot of uncomfortability. And I think especially for non-religious people, like a lot of them just don't bring it up much. Like we actually measured concealment, and concealment concealment of, just like, concealment among LGBTQ people, concealment of one's non-religious beliefs can be harmful in a lot of ways. If you can't be open about your identity and beliefs, it's somewhat stigmatizing, and it also means you have a harder time connecting as like a person with others who are more able to be open about themselves. But especially among family and close family, there was an extended family, there was a much higher rate of concealment among young non-religious people than older non-religious people. The only place where there was less concealment was at school. So I think that's really interesting because it shows you school can be a really important avenue for people to sort of develop those connections broader and make, friends with other people that are non-religious.
Yeah, and an opportunity to defend and to create a network of people who have similar identities and who are going through a similar process. I mean, that's why it's so important that people do talk about these things, that we don't stigmatize to the point that there actually is silence. I'm noticing a comment from one of our colleagues who says there are lots of nuns, N-O-N-E-S, who do in fact believe in God, they're just not affiliated. And again, that makes this even more complex to have as a conversation.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think Pew did some research on that, and they found a significant percentage. I think almost a third believed in some sort of God. So, maybe it may not be a traditional definition of a God, but it's still not atheist.
Can I ask one more question, Allison? I'm just kind of curious. So if you find yourself in one of these conversations, I mean, we talk about how you interrupt bias and how you interrupt discrimination, in using our privilege to have these conversations. If we find ourselves, talking, listening to somebody and they're making negative comments about people who are atheists, how do you suggest we have those conversations? Because I think they really quickly spiral down to you're a godless heathen, and that's not helpful. And I don't react well when people say that because I am from Jersey and I will tell you what I think. So any coaching that you have, Jersey City forever, any coaching that you might offer on ways for us to kind of direct people to learn more and how to effectively have that conversation about what this really means?
Sure. I think we have information about, non-religion and atheism and what it is on our website. So it's atheist.org. The information about the survey is on secularsurvey.org, and there's a lot of information there. We are actually putting out a variety of different population-based surveys. Like for example, we're working on one now about Black non-religious communities. So I'm really excited about that one. It's going out soon. As far as interrupting, the cycle, I think it's important to be polite and to sort of say things like, well, I think we need to be inclusive of everybody's beliefs, and have you considered how what you're saying might impact non-religious people that are participating in this event, or those sorts of things, to sort of make it clear that even if you don't have to be non-religious to bring this up, right? You can just help make the point that we should be respectful, and people are allowed to have disagreements, especially on things as important and personal as religion.
I have to tell you, as someone who is religious, it horrifies me that people would be that mean. Like, to me, it feels like my responsibility as someone who is religious to actually interrupt when people are rude about that. That would seem to be my responsibility. I mean, my belief or not believing, it's part of identity. Wow. This just reframes the whole thing, Allison.
Well, I'm so glad you invited me today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And please, if you ever have any stuff, please come back, because this is such important information. And I think it's a conversation people need to have more, and we need to understand better. And data helps us do that. And particularly when you have data on communities outside of white communities, I'd be really fascinated to have that, because I think we can get into a lot of different layers of what is going on and the discrimination people are looking at.
Absolutely. And I'll say we do have some of that already in the main report we put out. It's called Reality Check. It looks at different communities. However, we're going to be doing deeper dives on several different communities, which I'm very excited about.
Oh, I'm excited too, because I did see that data and I thought I would love more of this. So if you have not read the report, make sure you are going to atheist.org so you can put your hands on that and read the report. And Allison, thank you so much for being here and spending time with us and explaining it and answering all of the questions that I had, plus everybody who is watching. You are awesome.
Thank you so much.
And Liz, thank you once again for being my partner in crime for 30 minutes of my Thursday.
Always happy to be here.
Well, this wraps up this week's show. Next week, we will be back. We have another great conversation coming up for you. As usual, if you need help, please visit us at pflag.org to get more information or support. My name is Jean Marie Navetta. Make sure that you join us again next week for something to talk about. I will wrap up the way we wrap up every single week, which is to remind you to run fast, to laugh hard, and to be kind. Also wear your mask, even though mine is behind me and I can't turn around right now to get it. But please keep wearing those masks, and we'll see you again next week. Bye, everybody.